Chapter 6. A New Beginning. George Muller looked down from the pulpit at the crowd of bobbing bonnets and balding heads in Ebenezer Chapel at Tigmouth. A lot had happened in the 3 months since he had left London. George had gone back to Devon to visit his friend Henry Craik, who had arranged for him to preach at a number of various chapels around the area during his visit. Now, 12 weeks later, Ebenezer Chapel had asked him to become its pastor. As he looked out over the congregation, George knew it had not been an easy decision for the congregation to make. Indeed, a few people had left the church over the young Prussian upstart who thought he could preach to good English Christians. Still others had been impressed by George's preaching, particularly its results. 5 new converts had joined the church as a result of George's preaching, and more than filled the spaces by those who had left the church over George's becoming the new pastor. When he had finished the morning sermon, George cleared his throat. "There is one more thing I need to say," he began nervously. "I accept your generous offer to call me as your pastor on one condition. I cannot promise you how long I will stay here. I must be free to go where God leads me, when He leads me. If you allow me to do that, I will stay and be your pastor." As George looked down at the small congregation of only 18 members, he wondered whether he was making a mistake. He had prayed long and hard about taking the position. It seemed strange to him that God would lead him away from the bustling city like London to Tigmouth, a small fishing village on the edge of Tygan estuary, where his congregation was made up of mostly unschooled fishermen and their wives. Still, George reminded himself that if he was prepared to travel, there was plenty of work for a missionary to do in Devon. Christian groups from Newton Abbot to Exeter were eager to have George preach at their weekly Bible studies and prayer meetings, and George was more than happy to do so. Indeed, after officially becoming the pastor at Ebenezer Chapel, George came to know the roads that crisscross Devon like he knew the back of his hand. One place he particularly liked to visit in the summer of 1830 was Northern Hay House in Exeter. Northern Hay House was a boarding establishment whose housekeeper was Miss Mary Groves. Mary was a strong Christian in her early 30s who liked to talk with George about religious things, especially his views about the Plymouth Brethren. George had enjoyed several long conversations with her before he realized she was in fact the sister of Anthony Groves, the missionary to Prussia he'd heard so much about. It was then that he understood why Mary had so many interesting opinions about missionaries and the church. The more time he spent with Mary Groves, the more George came to like her. Mary was not a giggly kind of woman like Ermengarde had been, nor was she pretty like Ermengarde. In fact, she had one of the largest noses George had ever seen on a man or a woman. Yet, there was something about her that appealed to him. Mary looked right into his eyes when she spoke, and she expected him to treat her as an equal, not as a decoration. Mary was better educated than most women of her day. She spoke French, Latin, and Hebrew, and knew more about astronomy than George did. The relationship blossomed, and George found himself in love with Mary. Such a feeling surprised him for more than one reason. First, Mary Groves was 30 years old, 8 years older than he was. And second, he had not been looking for or even considering a wife. As far as he was concerned, a wife would slow him down. What if God called him to go to someplace strange or remote? Could he expect a wife to follow him? And would he feel as though marriage had made him a prisoner? Although George may not have expected just any wife to follow him, there was something different about Mary. Since Mary had seen her brother and sister-in-law give up everything they owned to go to the mission field, George sensed she would be willing to do the same, if necessary. He talked to Mary about his fears, and Mary assured him that a godly marriage would set him free to do even more than he was doing now, not the reverse. On October 7th, 1830, in a simple ceremony at Exeter, Mary Groves and George Muller were married. After a cup of tea with friends, they caught the stagecoach to Tidmouth. As he loaded Mary's trunks onto the stagecoach, George was a little surprised. 2 of the 4 trunks were particularly heavy. "I didn't know you had so much stuff," he muttered. "You didn't think my family was penniless, do you?" Mary replied, adjusting the ribbon on her bonnet. "I have the family silver and my mother's china, and several tapestries that have been in the family for generations. I think they will brighten up our house considerably." A week later, all of Mary's possessions were neatly arranged in George's tiny row house, which no longer looked like a bachelor lived in it. Mary had scrubbed and dusted and polished until everything looked so well cared for. One night, George came home weary from traveling. Mary met him at the door with a smile. "Come and see how good it all looks," she said, helping her new husband out of his coat. "I have hardly stopped cleaning and arranging all day." As George looked around the room, his heart sank. His house was beginning to look like so many other houses he had visited, cluttered with things. Things would stop him from answering God's call in his life. Things that would have to be packed up and transported from one place to another. Things that would mock his attempt to live only for God. He sank wearily into his chair. "They have to go," he said in a low voice. "What has to go?" frowned Mary. "Everything," replied George, waving his hand vaguely around the room. "The silver, the china, the tapestries. Everything that's not necessary has to go." But why?" stammered Mary, turning pale and sinking into a chair. "Because," said George, "I travel from one end of Devon to the other, preaching that the Bible is to be taken literally, and I come home at night to a home that's filled with baubles. After all, Jesus said, 'Sell all that you have and give to the poor,' didn't he?" "Yes, but," Mary said. "But what? Your brother did that, didn't he?" said George, cutting her off. "But he was going to be a missionary. That's different, quite different," protested Mary. "Is it?" asked George, raising his eyebrows. "Have you forgotten that you are married to a missionary? A Prussian Christian who has been sent by God to England." Mary opened her mouth, then closed it without saying a single word. The next evening when George came home, the silverware, china, and tapestries were all gone. Sitting on the cabinet in their place was a stack of pound notes. Mary pointed to them. "Do what you think is best with it, George, and may God help us both," she said. Only a week later, George had another piece of disturbing news for his wife. This time, it was concerning his salary. The Ebenezer Chapel paid George a generous salary of £55 a year. Most of this money came from a practice they called pew renting, whereby a person or family rented a particular church pew to sit on Sundays. The richest people in the church rented the most expensive pews in the front, leaving the poor people to sit in the back pews, or the cheap seats, as they were known. It had been this way in the churches of England and Europe for hundreds of years, but the more George thought about it, the more wrong he decided the practice was. Church should not be a place where people were divided up according to how much money they had. There were no poor second-class citizens in God's kingdom, and George did not see why there should be in the church on earth. Pew renting would have to go, and with it a good portion of the church's income, and in turn a good portion of George's salary. After dinner one evening in November, George and Mary Muller went for a walk along the seashore. The cockle and mussel sellers had gone home for the night, and the last few fishing boats were slipping into the harbor. "Mary," said George gently, "thank you for selling the things. Now, there is another matter we need to talk about." Mary stopped and looked directly at her husband. George took a deep breath before he went on. "It's the pew rent. I can't see how we can follow Jesus' commandment to treat all men equally as brothers if we give the rich people the best pews in the front of the church. In the Bible, the book of James clearly tells us that we are not to show favor to the rich people in the church, because that is dishonoring to the poor." After a long moment of silence, George heard Mary gasp. "George, that's our only income," Mary said, her voice trailing off. "I know," he replied gently. "You want me to say it's all right for you to give up our income?" she asked incredulously. "Yes," said George frankly. "I know it's hard, but I think it's the right thing to do. The congregation should be free to give to the church, just as God puts directly on them, not because they want the best pews in the church." "But what if they don't want to give freely to us?" asked Mary. "Well then, God will have to provide for us in another way," said George, reaching for his wife's hand. "Do you think you can do it?" Mary was silent for a long time as they continued to walk along the seashore. The only sounds were the waves lapping against the seawall and the gulls squawking overhead. Finally, Mary spoke. "Do what you think is best, George. I can trust God just like you do." George stopped and hugged his wife, tears spilling down his cheeks. Mary had been right. Marriage had not become a prison for him. Instead, it had given him a partner in faith. "God will not let us down," he said with more confidence than he actually felt at the moment. The next night, after dinner, the two of them went out for another walk, this time in the opposite direction, toward Ebenezer Street. When they reached the chapel, George unlocked it, and they both slipped inside. George lit the oil lamp at the back of the room and reached into the canvas bag he was carrying. He pulled out a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, that had a slot cut on the top and a hinged door on the side. "Hand me a nail, Mary," he said with a determined voice. Within 5 minutes, the box was securely attached to the back wall. "Do you have a sign?" he asked her. Mary nodded as she handed it to him. After George had nailed the sign over the box, he stood back to admire his handiwork. "Yes," he said, squeezing his wife's hand. "We are at the mercy of God now." He scanned the sign and nodded. "Just like it says, Mary. If anyone wants to support us, they are welcome to. We will never ask anyone for money. Instead, we will look to God to supply our needs." As the two of them knelt together beside a pew, they asked God to take care of them and give them the faith to keep their new plan. As George stepped outside, he grinned widely. He knew he felt like this once before. When was it? He was halfway home before he recalled that it was the day he had told his father he would no longer accept any money from him for his studies at Hale University. He had the same feeling of freedom, of being dependent on God and not on people. The feeling excited George greatly. Things did not work out quite as quickly, however, or as smoothly as they had at Hale. The year of 1831 was a trying one for the Mullers. Some members of the congregation continued to drop the same amount of money into the wooden box on the back wall as they had dropped into the offering plate, but many did not, probably because it was no longer buying them anything. Of course, this had a great impact on George's salary. On one desperate occasion, George and Mary sat down at dinner time to a table set with empty plates and nothing cooking in the oven. Undeterred, George offered a prayer of thanks. As he prayed, there was a knock at the door. A friend in nearby Exmouth had sent a special delivery, a whole ham. George prayed an even greater prayer of thanks. Then he carved the ham so that he and Mary could eat. Another time, a total stranger had come to the door. When Mary opened it, she was met by a woman who gave her a curtsy. "I could not eat while I thought of you going hungry, ma'am," she said, handing Mary a freshly baked loaf of bread. Before Mary could ask her name or where she was from, the woman had disappeared. Often, when George was away preaching, the churches he visited would offer him money. George always refused it, saying he did not want to leave the impression that he was preaching for money. Not to be put off, the churches found creative ways to pay their preacher. Sometimes George would find money stuffed into his Bible, or Mary, who often traveled with him, would find that someone had slipped coins into her purse while she was not looking. All in all, by the end of the year, George and Mary had learned several things about trusting God. First, he did always provide for them. They never missed a meal or had a need that was not met in some way. Second, to trust him fully, they had to learn to give away any extra money they had. They never kept money they did not need and never allowed themselves to borrow a single penny, even if they had need. They believed that God would provide exactly what they needed when they needed it, and He did. In the spring of 1831, George thanked God for how well everything had turned out. He had come to Teignmouth 16 months earlier with no job, little money, and one friend. Now he could not walk down the street without being stopped a dozen times to talk with friends. He had given up his salary of £55, and in turn, God had provided food and rent money. He now had a wife who stood beside him, and in 5 months their first child would be born. The church congregation had grown to 51 members, many of them recent converts. Everything was going well for George in Teignmouth, except for one detail. George didn't think that he belonged there anymore. Chapter 7. A Mission Field Right Here. "Bristol?" Mary Muller exclaimed. "Whatever makes you think we should move to Bristol? Can't we stay here, at least until the baby comes?" She brushed tears from her eyes as she spoke. George put his arm around his wife. "Mary," he said gently, "I told you, and I told the whole congregation, that I would stay here only as long as God called me to." "But George," Mary interrupted, "how can we be sure?" George was silent for a long moment. It was hard to explain, but the more he had prayed about it, the more he knew God was calling him northward to Bristol. Henry Craik was already living there and had written to George encouraging him to visit. In April 1832, George had taken him up on the offer. Bristol was a bustling port city, second only to Liverpool in the number of ships it serviced. Like any other English city in the early 19th century, it was a smoky and dirty place. Beggars stood on the street corners, and small dirty children weaved through the crowds, no doubt looking for a purse to snatch or a pocket to pick. Yet for all its crime and poverty, or rather because of it, George had felt that Bristol was a city he could work in, a city that needed plenty of help. George and Henry Craik had held 10 days of meetings at the Gideon and Plithay chapels in each city. Each night was busier than the night before, until on April 29th, Gideon Chapel was filled to overflowing. People sat on the chairs, others gathered outside the open windows, and still more crammed into the foyer at the back of the chapel. Many others had to be turned away because there was simply no more room anywhere for them. After the meeting, many of the regular members of the congregation at Gideon Chapel begged George to move to Bristol. George and Henry Craik talked long into the night about it, finally drawing up a list of requirements that the congregation would need to agree to before George could even consider such a move. Number 1, George Muller and Henry Craik would not be traditional pastors, asking the congregation or board members what they thought best for them to do in every situation. Rather, they needed to be free to do whatever they felt God was calling them to do. Number 2, all pew rents were to be abolished, and neither man would be paid a salary. Together, the pastors and the congregation would trust God for enough money to run the chapel and meet all their needs. Number 3, George and Henry would be joint pastors, working together as a team, without one being the senior and the other the junior pastor. George knew that these were not easy conditions for a church to meet, and when he received a letter from Henry Craik saying the congregation had agreed to all of them, he began to feel he should give serious consideration to moving to Bristol. As he prayed long and hard about it, deep down he knew it was indeed time to leave Tidmouth for Bristol. Finally, Mary sighed, "Do what you think is best, George. I am sure I can have a baby just as well in Bristol as I could here, though I will miss all my friends." George had compassion for his wife. He had lived in many places, but she had been in Devon all her life. He knew it would be hard for her to make new friends, but he was sure he was doing the right thing. "That's it, then," he concluded. "I'll start visiting everyone in the congregation tomorrow and tell them our plans myself." 2 days and many tears later, George Muller had told everyone at Ebenezer Chapel that he was moving to Bristol. It took less than an hour to pack their few belongings, and with sad hearts, on May 25th, 1832, the Mullers boarded a stagecoach for Bristol. George was now 26 years old. As the stage rumbled along, he wondered what challenges lay ahead for him. At first, everything went smoothly. The Mullers and Henry Craik found a modest house with 5 bedrooms and 2 sitting rooms where they could live together. A rich Christian man had rented a second chapel called Bethsaida Chapel, and the 2 men divided services between it and Gideon Chapel. Meanwhile, Mary remained in good health, with the baby being due at the end of September. It was the church bells, though, that first alerted George to a looming disaster in the city. The bells tolled after a funeral, and at the beginning of June they began to toll almost non-stop. A cholera epidemic had descended on Bristol. In 19th century England, major differences existed between a city and a village. In villages, people lived in their own cottage or in a small group of row houses. They drank water from their own wells and got rid of their bathroom waste in their own gardens. In cities, Bristol included, things were much different. People lived in long rows of brick houses that snaked for miles without a single tree or field in sight. Dirty water and sewage overflowed from open drains that ran alongside the streets. And the water that was piped into houses was untreated and often carried germs and bacteria from polluted streams. These differences made conditions ripe for deadly diseases to spread in the city, and no disease was more feared than cholera. Cholera spread like wildfire, killing thousands of people. George and Henry Craik were called out at all hours of the day and night to pray for those who had been stricken with the disease. Those who caught it usually died quickly. Often it only took 12 hours from the time a person first began to feel sick and started vomiting to the time he or she was laid in a coffin. That is, if a coffin could be found. The work was exhausting, and it seemed like it would never end. All through July and August, bodies piled up on the sidewalks, waiting for carts to carry them away. Often they were there rotting for a week or more because the cart driver himself had died, and it was difficult to find someone else brave enough to replace him. Everyone knew that the best chance for staying healthy was to keep away from other people, especially large groups of people, where the disease could spread quickly. However, the folks at the two chapels wanted to continue meeting together to comfort and encourage one another. George and Henry agreed with them, and so they held a prayer meeting each morning to ask God to spare them and to stop the epidemic. Often, 200 or 300 people would ignore the risks of meeting together and show up to be led in prayer by George or Henry. Even though the people prayed earnestly, the church bells in the city continued to toll. It was hard for George as he trudged from one end of Bristol to the other. The young pastor was welcomed into any house he stopped at. Even total strangers reached out and grabbed him as he walked by. George would read the Bible aloud to them and pray for the dying, and he would comfort a hysterical widow who now had no way to feed her ragged, hollow-cheeked children. Mary Muller was fighting her own battle. Every morning she watched her husband walk out of the door and into danger. Each time George reached out to hold the hand of a dying child, or help a woman lay her husband's dead body out, or hug a little child, he was exposing himself to cholera. "What if you get sick?" Mary asked him. "Have you thought of that?" George nodded silently. Of course, he had thought about it 1,000 times. Every meal could easily be his last, especially given the number of people he touched who were dying. "But I have to do it, Mary. Somebody has to help these people and let them know God cares." "And what about me?" Mary pleaded. "Does God care about me and our little one? There is nothing to guarantee you will even be alive to see it born." She wiped away the tears with the corner of her apron as she spoke. I know," said George soothingly. "But Mary, you cannot imagine me hiding inside my own house while there are people who need God's comfort and the little I can do for them, can you?" Mary shook her head. "No," she agreed quietly. "That would not be the man I married." On September 16th, George did stay home all day to assist the midwife with the birth of his baby daughter, Lydia. In spite of all the death around them, Lydia was a thriving, healthy baby. By the time she was a month old, the cholera epidemic had finally run its course. A huge service of Thanksgiving was held at Gideon Chapel. Of the 200 people who regularly attended the two chapels, only one had died. January 4th, 1833, brought with it a blessing and a mystery. That morning, George had collected the mail and noticed a letter postmarked from Baghdad. When he slit open the envelope, a check for 200 pounds fell out. George quickly scanned the letter that came with it for some kind of a clue as to what the money was for. No one could have been more surprised than George when he read that the money was for him, his family, and Henry Craik to travel to Baghdad to be missionaries there. The letter writer promised more money would follow when they arrived. Excitement stirred inside George. Was this the opportunity he had been waiting for since becoming a Christian? Had all this time in England been training to prepare him to go to tell the lost souls in another land about God? He hoped so. His brother-in-law, Anthony Groves, wrote regularly from Persia, and the life of a foreign missionary sounded much more adventurous than that of a pastor in England, making endless house calls and drinking bottomless cups of tea. George hurried off to tell Henry Craik about the letter. Henry, too, was excited. The two of them talked about it all morning, and by lunchtime, they had all but convinced themselves that they should both go to Baghdad. After lunch, George had promised to visit a member of the congregation, a cobbler who lived about 2 miles away in the poorest part of Bristol. It had rained the night before. As he made his way there, George had to jump over muddy puddles, and every carriage that went by sprayed water up at him. George had just passed the bakery on Newfoundland Street when a little girl came up to him. She was no more than 5 years old, and she was piggybacking a toddler, a small boy with a runny nose and wearing only a torn pair of trousers. "Please, mister," the little girl said with a lisp, "could you spare us a shilling? Me ma's gone with the cholera, and me dad went to the mines and didn't come back." George stopped and crouched beside the little girl. "What's your name, dear?" he asked, thinking of his own daughter tucked in her warm crib. "Emily," she replied, "and I can spell it too. Me ma taught me." Her eyes shone with delight from her dark, streaked face. "Can you now?" smiled George. "Well, I'll tell you what. You spell it correctly, and you will have earned your shilling." "E-M-I-L-Y, she said triumphantly as she stuck out her grubby hand. George laughed. "Perfect," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Here's your shilling, and God bless you, Emily." As Emily hitched her brother higher up on her back and picked her way through the crowd, George felt strangely saddened. He had seen little girls and boys like Emily every day of the 6 months he had lived in Bristol, but none of them had affected him like this. Where was Emily going? Did she have anywhere to sleep at night? Was a kind adult watching over her? Or was she at the mercy of some evil person? What would happen to her brother, if she got sick? Or where would she go for help if he became ill? These questions haunted George Muller, and as he walked along, he wondered why he had not seen it before. He didn't need to go to the mission field in Baghdad, or anywhere else for that matter. He was standing in the middle of a mission field. Surely there could be no more needy people in all the world than these little children like Emily and her brother. Baghdad might sound foreign and exciting with its colorful bazaars, camels, and pipe music, but there was also work to be done in dirty, overcrowded Bristol. George did not know how to go about it, or what a lone person with no regular income could do, but he knew one thing, that with God's help, he would do something to help the poor homeless children of Bristol. Yes, he said to himself aloud, as he quickened his pace, God has given me a mission field right here, and I will live and die in it. Chapter 8. The Breakfast Club. "Where will they all sit?" asked Mary Muller as she stood in her living room, lifting the heavy iron to press one of her husband's collars. Lydia, a serious little 1-year-old toddler, scurried around at her feet. "I don't know," said George. "I was thinking of asking the grocer if he had any apple boxes he could spare. Tipped on their sides, They'd make good seats, don't you think?" Mary nodded vaguely. "I suppose so," she replied. "You really are determined to do this, aren't you?" "Yes," replied George firmly. "There are children out in the streets of Bristol who have never heard the name of God, have never set foot in a church, and have no reason on this earth to hope. I have to do what little I can do to help them. Right now, the best I can do is invite them in for breakfast and read the scriptures to them." "But how many do you think will show up? Do you have a limit on how many we can feed?" asked Mary Muller, panic beginning to show on her face. "How is it all going to work, George? We hardly have enough breakfast for the three of us most of the time." "If God is in this, He will supply," was George's reply. And so the breakfast club began. Within a month of its start, 20 to 30 ragged children were gathered around the Muller steps each morning. At 8 o'clock, George invited them in. Mary greeted them at the door. A pitcher of warm water was waiting on the counter inside, and the children took turns washing their faces and hands. Then they took their seats on the apple boxes that were placed around the oak table in the parlor. Mary ladled out a large helping of oatmeal to each child, and then George said grace. The children ate noisily, while Mary poured them cups of strong tea. While the children shoveled spoonfuls of sugar into the tea, George began the Bible lesson. Sometimes he would read a story aloud to them, acting out the various parts as he went. The popularity of the breakfast club grew. Until a year later, there was no more room for even one more apple box in the Muller's parlor. 40 people, not just children, showed up for breakfast every morning. Many adults needed food and Bible reading, and George knew there were hundreds, if not thousands, of other children in Bristol who needed a good breakfast and a Bible lesson. But he could not reach them all, at least not from inside his parlor. There had to be a way to do more, but how? For days, George paced the floor. He had something on his mind, something that would not go away. It was a name, a long name. The Scriptural Knowledge Institution for Home and Abroad. George could picture exactly what it would be. An organization run by Christian men like himself. An organization with three purposes: to establish day schools, Sunday schools, and adult schools for the poor, provide Bibles for people who could not afford to buy them, and help foreign missionaries with financial gifts. To accomplish these goals, George decided the organization would never ask a non-Christian for money or allow such a person to sit on its board. Nor would it go into debt of any kind. The success of the organization would be judged not by how much money it raised, but rather how it spent what it had. With this all settled in his mind, George went to talk to Henry Craik, who agreed with all George outlined. A meeting was announced for March 5th, 1834. About 100 people came to listen to the two pastors as they outlined their idea for the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for Home and Abroad. Many people thought it was too bold, too far-fetched to ever become a reality. 2 weeks later, on March 19th, Mary Muller gave birth to their second child, a son whom they named Elijah. Of course, the new arrival stretched the Mullers' finances, and by April, George had become very frustrated. Despite the public meeting and the hours George had spent praying and planning with Henry Craik, the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for Home and Abroad had not gotten off the ground. Not one penny had been raised for it, and George began to wonder whether he had made a big mistake. He decided to pray a very specific prayer. In his bedroom, George knelt beside his bed and prayed, "God, I believe you gave me the idea to start this organization, but I am not making any progress. If you want me to keep on with it, please send me £20 to demonstrate this is your will. I'll use the 20 pounds to buy Bibles to give away. Amen." When he got up from his knees, George felt much better. The matter was in God's hands now, not his. If it succeeded, it would be because God had blessed it. If it failed, it would be because he had not. That evening, as the Mullers were sitting down to eat a meal of mutton stew, which seemed to contain more potatoes than meat, there was a knock at the door. When George opened the door, a woman from Gideon Chapel stood before him. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," she said, curtsying, "but I had something on my mind, and I cannot get rest from it. Here, take this, and God bless you." She thrust her hand into her coat pocket and pulled out a white envelope. George reached out and took the envelope from the woman. The envelope felt like it had money in it, a pile of notes. The woman turned to walk down the steps. "Wait a minute, please," said George. "I have a question for you." The woman stopped. "What is it?" she asked as she turned around. "I was wondering exactly what you would want me to do with this." "Well," she said, "whatever your need is." George frowned. The woman sounded unsure. "But did you have something in particular you would like to see done with it?" he probed. "Well, to be honest with you, if you don't have any other urgent need, I kind of fancy the money going to buy Bibles for the poor." She gave a little smile. "Thank you," said George, stepping down to grasp her hand. "Thank you 100 times." As George closed the door and walked back into the parlor, Mary looked up at him. "What is it, George?" she asked. "An answer to my prayer," he said, his face shining with joy. "If I'm not mistaken, this envelope should contain 20 pounds. He tore it open, and sure enough, 4 5-pound notes fell out. "Oh, Mary," he exclaimed, "God is in this after all. We had better get ready. I know he is about to open the floodgates." And open they did. Within 6 months of receiving the first gift, the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for Home and Abroad was providing education for 120 children in Sunday school and 200 children and 40 adults in day school. 1,000 Bibles had been purchased and given away, and 57 pounds had been sent overseas for the support of missionaries. George accounted for every half penny of the money in his meticulous records. Everything was recorded, from the principal's salary to the coal for the heaters, the chalk for the blackboard, and cricket balls for sports day. For the next year, things proceeded well for the Mullers. George was still pastor of Gideon and Bethsaida chapels. He continued giving free breakfasts to the poor children. He oversaw the day schools and Sunday schools. And in his spare time, he enjoyed spending time with his own 2 children, Lydia, who was now 2, and baby Elijah. But in June 1835, tragedy struck the family. Elijah, now 15 months old, became sick with influenza. George had visited enough sick children to know that his son was in grave danger. He wrote in his journal, "May the Lord's holy will be done concerning our dear little one." The next day, Elijah died. It was a very difficult time for George, who missed his son terribly. But it was even more difficult time for Mary. 4 days earlier, her father, whom she had been close to, had died. Now she was left with 2 funerals to arrange and attend in a single week. Later that same year, ill health crept up on George. George had never quite fully recovered from his stomach hemorrhage, and the old problem flared up again. Mary feared that her husband might die on her as well. The doctor made it clear to George that he needed a change of air if he was to have any hope of recovery. So, with Mary and Lydia, George traveled to the Isle of Wight, where he spent his 30th birthday. For once, George had time to read. He took advantage of it. He read the biographies of many great missionaries, including John Newton. He also took time to read various newspapers. Each day, the consequences of the Poor Law Amendment Act seemed to make the headlines, and George could see why. Until 1834, the English government, through church parishes, had helped to support working people during times when they were unable to find a job. This support had kept many families from starving and allowed men the dignity of returning to work as soon as they could find it. However, in 1834, that had all changed. In an effort to save money, the government had taken away the support it provided for the working poor and replaced it with a policy stating that a family that could not support itself would have to go to a poorhouse. Even as George convalesced on the Isle of Wight, many new poorhouses were being built around the country. Poorhouses were awful places, and they were meant to be. The government wanted them to be as unattractive as possible, to discourage people from applying. But without the financial support from the government, hundreds of working families, single parents, and orphans had nowhere else to turn, no matter how unattractive the poorhouses were made to be. The more George read about these places, the sadder he became. Husbands, wives, and children in the poorhouses were all separated and made to do the most menial work. For 12 or 14 hours a day, people were forced to crush horse and cow bones by hand, break apart rocks, and hand grind corn. After a day's work, they flopped exhausted into their lice and flea-infested bunks, knowing they would have to get up the next day and do it all over again. In return for their labor, workers got 2 meals a day to be eaten in silence. All children 7 years old and up were made to work and were not allowed to see their parents, even if they were in the same poorhouse. The death rate in the poorhouses was high. Disease flourished in these horrid living conditions, and such a sense of hopelessness hung in the air that many people committed suicide. Every day on the Isle of Wight, George prayed for Henry Craik and the ongoing work in Bristol, where he longed to be. With the growing poorhouse situation, there was going to be more work than ever. As soon as George got better, he returned to Bristol. On November 15th, he wrote in his diary, "We arrived safely. Last week we prayed repeatedly concerning the work of the Scriptural Knowledge Institution, and especially that the Lord would give us the means to continue and even enlarge the work." In a short time of George's return to Bristol, 3 events occurred, any one of which was interesting, but when put together, they convinced George that it was time to begin the work for which he would become known around the world by. The principal of the boys' school, run by the Scriptural Knowledge Institution, came to report on the school's progress. George knew each student in the school. He knew his likes and dislikes, and what he hoped to be when he grew up. As a result, George was very interested in what the principal had to say, since each student represented a hope for the future. George was upset to learn that Freddie, one of the first boys to enroll, and a good student, had been taken to the poorhouse. Children had fewer rights than anyone else in the poorhouse. Freddie would not be allowed visitors unless the matron approved them. He could not leave the poorhouse to go to school, and he could not own any private property, not even the Bible George had given him. George lay his head in his hands. "Why did it have to happen to Freddie?" he asked, directing his question at no one in particular. The principal responded, "It seemed his father was dragged off to jail for petty theft, I think, and he died there the same night. His mother was taken by cholera, and his aunt took care of him. She waited until there was not a scrap of food left in the house, and then she marched Freddie down to the poorhouse so he could at least eat. "It's so unfair," replied George. "What good is it opening schools if the children can't come because they have no food and no lodging?" The question hung in the air, and George was still trying to work out an answer when he visited Bill Wentworth, a member of the congregation at Gideon Chapel. Bill Wentworth pumped the bellows for the forge at one of the new factories that were springing up all over Bristol. Indeed, George was actually surprised to find him home, since Bill Wentworth seemed to be at work all the time. "Hello, Mr. Wentworth. May I come in?" called George through the open doorway. "Of course you can. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll have the missus put a pot of tea on for us." Bill Wentworth wiped his hands on a dirty rag. "What can I do for you, then?" "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd visit. I'm surprised to catch you home," replied George. Bill Wentworth nodded grimly. "Yeah, I'm glad for the job, don't make any mistake about that, but the hours are awful long. Normally I work 16 hours a day, sometimes longer." He coughed hard when he stopped thinking. "And do you have time for prayer and the Bible study?" George asked. Bill Wentworth looked sheepish. "Not really. By the time I'm done with work, I'm not much good for anything but sleep, to be honest." "Have you ever thought of working less?" "You don't sound too healthy," said George. Bill Wentworth laughed scornfully. "If you don't mind me saying, it's all very well to say what you should be doing from the pulpit. It's quite another thing to have to earn a living for your family. Why, if I didn't work all the time, the family would be dragged off to the poorhouse, and we all know what that looks like." George nodded. Many in his congregation had told him that they worked so much that they didn't have any time left for spiritual things. Still, George was not ready to give up on Bill Wentworth. "You have to understand that God has promised to supply the needs of all his children. Jesus told us to seek God's kingdom first, and he will add all the other things to us." "It's a fine idea, Pastor, but if I cut back my hours, I don't think God would provide real things for me, like shoes or food. Do you?" Bill Wentworth looked a little embarrassed. "I mean, I know the Bible says he can do that, and you preach it and all, but I've never seen it for myself in real life, if you know what I mean." George again nodded. He did know what Bill Wentworth was meaning, only too well. He had heard the same argument 100 times before. Yes, the person believed that God could provide for him, but no, he was not prepared to take time out of his overworked life to pray and serve others and allow God to meet his needs. George longed for someone or something to point to, something he could show a person and say, "Look, he honored God, and God is looking after him in every way." Several days after visiting Bill Wentworth, George visited another member of the congregation. Unlike Bill, Elizabeth Brinston had a lot of spare time, and judging from her collection of books, George figured she must spend a lot of it reading. As he sat in a well-padded chair chatting with Elizabeth, a servant poured them tea. "Please have a scone," Elizabeth offered, holding out a fine china plate with 5 scones neatly arranged on it. Each scone was spread with bright red raspberry jam, with a dollop of Devonshire cream on top. "Thank you," said George. "These look delicious." "I see you have a great many interesting books. Do you mind if I look?" "By all means," replied Elizabeth. "If any of them interest you, feel free to borrow them." George put down his cup of tea and scone and stood up to scan the bookshelf nearest him. Many of the books he had studied at school and at university. There were also ancient Greek and Latin texts, as well as some books by new English novelists. George reached up to pull out a small, dark, leather-bound book that had no name on its spine. "You might be interested in that book, Pastor. If I remember correctly, it was translated from German," Elizabeth said as George lifted the book from its shelf. Goosebumps ran up and down George's neck as he turned the book over and read its title. The volume was an English translation of the biography of A.H. Frank, the professor from Hale University who had started the orphanage in Hale. "Do you know the book?" asked Elizabeth. "As a matter of fact, I do," replied George. "When I was a university student at Hale, I stayed in a room at the orphanage he started." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled. "Then you must take the book, Pastor Muller. I'm sure you will want to reacquaint yourself with the wonderful story." George lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. He thought about Bill Wentworth and all the men and women he was constantly encouraging to trust God. What or who was it he could point to help them understand what he was talking about? He thought about Freddie, who at that very moment was alone in a room filled with men, some kind and some mentally ill, and some just plain evil. And he thought of the biography of A.H. Frank, and how strange it was to find it in a private library in Bristol, England. "Somehow," George prayed, "let me be a light to those around me, and help me find a way to reach the orphans before it's too late." In his wildest dreams, George Muller could not have imagined how his simple prayer would be answered. Chapter 9. The First Orphanage in Bristol. The Wednesday night, 2 weeks before Christmas, was cold and windy. George and Mary Muller walked arm in arm up Paul Street from their home towards Gideon Chapel on their way to a special meeting. When they arrived, they found the chapel was already crowded with people. They made their way to the front of the chapel. As George stood to speak, he could feel his heart thumping wildly with excitement and anticipation. He cleared his throat and began the speech that was to be the outline for the rest of his life's work. "I have called this meeting for one purpose," he began. "God has told me to start an orphanage." The audience let out a gasp and murmured as George went on to tell them about the pattern of the operation for his orphanage. There would be no collections, no asking for money, and no payment required from the children who were taken in. Instead, George would rely on God to supply all the needs of the orphans. After he had finished talking, George invited questions from the audience. Some were practical, such as, where was the orphanage to be located? George did not know, since God had not shown him a house yet. What orphans would be taken in, and how many? George thought there would probably be around 30 girls, aged 7 to 12. How old would a girl be when she was left the orphanage? George wasn't sure. He hoped to find work for most of the girls as domestic servants when they were 12, but no girl would be returned to the streets because she was too old for the orphanage. Some place would be found for her to go. Did he have any staff? Not yet. Some of the questions were more spiritual. One man, with a long gold chain draped across his ample belly, asked if George really thought God was interested in the daily needs of an orphanage. Did he honestly think, for instance, that God would send chamber pots and bandages, school books and socks for all 30 girls whom no one loved or cared about? George replied that they would have to wait and see. But in his experience, there wasn't anything too large or too small to ask God for. The questions were finished. George concluded the meeting in prayer, and then he made his way to the back of the chapel to greet people on their way out. There he heard all the comments people had not wanted to make in front of others. "I do think it's a big project to take on," said one elderly woman. "I think if God is calling you to work with orphans, you might be better to take one or two into your own home. It doesn't do to bite off more than you can chew. Besides, if the orphanage failed, it would be an embarrassment to all of us," she told George, patting him soothingly on the arm. "I've never heard of such a thing," muttered another man as he put on his hat and coat. "I don't see how it could possibly work. The poorhouse is the best place for an orphan. Can't get into any mischief there." "If you were an Englishman, Mr. Muller," began another woman in a proud voice, "you would know that this type of thing is not possible in England. It is not the way we do things here. Perhaps asking God to supply all your needs is the way things are done in Prussia, but not here." George looked her in the eye. "I believe God is our provider wherever we live," he said kindly, thinking to himself that this was one of the reasons he was starting the orphanage, to show people that God does indeed provide. But for every negative comment, there was a positive one to counterbalance it. One woman pressed a 10-shilling note into George's hand and said, "I will pray for you every day, Pastor Muller. May God guide you." Another woman stood squarely in front of George, and looking him right in the eye, she said, "I'm not much with book learning, sir, but I know how to cook and clean, and goodness knows I've mended 1,000 socks in my day. If I can be of use in your new orphanage, I'm ready to be put to work. And don't worry about paying me. The good Lord's never let me starve yet, and I don't think he's about to now. If you have faith for those 30 girls, I can have faith for myself." "God bless you and thank you," said George, shaking her hand. "You are just the type of person we need. Come to my house tomorrow and we'll talk." The woman nodded and waved goodbye as she walked out the door. As George and Mary walked home, they talked about the meeting. Despite the negative comments, it had been a good evening in many ways. George had known that some people would disagree with his plan, but he also knew that some people, like the woman who offered to cook and clean for the girls, would be in favor of it. Those people were an inspiration. The next morning, the local newspaper printed a small article about the meeting under the headline, "Local Minister Intends to Set Up Orphanage." The article said that if George succeeded, it would be the first orphanage in Bristol. In fact, according to the newspaper, there were only 10 or 12 orphanages in the whole of England, and all but one of them were private orphanages, taking only children whose parents had been of some means, but now found themselves without sufficient funds to care entirely for all of their needs. The London Orphan Asylum, for example, insisted that children of domestic or agricultural servants and children of journeymen's tradesmen would not be eligible. On top of this, children with any medical problems, diseases, or deformities were not accepted. George was glad he had made it clear that the new orphanage would not turn away any child in need as long as there was space for the child. Later that same day, George received a letter. He frowned as he turned it over and saw that it was postmarked from a town 100 miles north of Bristol. He could not think of anyone he knew there. He opened the letter and began to read. "Mary, Mary!" he yelled. "Come and listen to this." Mary came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, George?" she asked, surprised. "This letter is from a married couple. Listen to what it says." He cleared his throat and began to read. "We offer ourselves to the service of the intended orphanage, if you think us qualified for it." "Oh, George!" gasped Mary. "However did they know? You only announced it last night. Now, counting the housekeeper, we have 3 possible workers." "Mary, wait! There's more!" And George continued to read on. "Also, we would give up all our furniture, etc., which the Lord has given us for its use. And we would do this without receiving any salary whatsoever, believing that if it is God's will to employ us, He would supply all our needs." "Isn't it wonderful, George?" said Mary, grasping her husband's hand. "Everything is happening so quickly." In a way it was, yet in another way, George had been preparing for this for many years, ever since the day he had trusted God would supply his needs at Hale University. George answered the couple immediately and accepted their offer, though he did tell them the orphanage didn't yet have a house or anything to put in it except what the couple brought with them. No sooner had he mailed the letter than household items began arriving at his home. One man who had been at the meeting the night before had collected things from his neighbors to give to the orphanage. 4 knives and 5 forks, 1 jug, 4 mugs, 3 salt stands, 3 dishes, 3 basins, and 28 plates. After the man left, George scooped 3-year-old Lydia into his arms. "You see, little one, God will supply all our needs according to the riches of His glory," he said, this as much to himself as to her. Lydia giggled as she whirled around and around in the parlor. George continued to pray over the next week, and the things the orphans needed flowed in. Blankets, money, fabric for the girls' nightgowns, tablecloths, pillowcases, sheets, more basins, plates, and silverware arrived at the house almost hourly. George kept a careful record of every item and every penny that was donated. After dinner on December 17th, 1835, George sat at his desk and pulled out his black leather-bound journal. Lydia played at his feet as he dipped his pen into the inkwell and wrote. This evening another brother brought a clothes horse, 3 frocks, 4 pinafores, 6 handkerchiefs, 3 counterpans, 1 blanket, 2 pewter salt cellars, 6 tin cups, and 6 metal teaspoons. He also brought 3 shillings and 6 pence given to him by 3 different individuals. At the same time, he told me that it had been put on the heart of an individual to send tomorrow 100 pounds. The next afternoon, the same man returned with more items, including 16 thimbles, an iron, a sugar basin, 4 combs, and 100 pounds promised. He counted the money out for George, but instead of being happy to receive it, George was troubled when he heard who had given it. A poor spinster who lived in a boarding house. George knew that the woman made only about 3 shillings and 6 pence a week by taking in hand sewing jobs. It would have taken her 12 years to earn 100 pounds. All night, George tossed and turned, thinking about the spinster. Where had she got the money? What would happen to her if she needed it later? Did she understand what she was doing? Or was she being overly emotional instead of thinking it through? By the following morning, George knew what he had to do. He neatly folded the 100-pound note and slipped it into his vest pocket. "Mary," he called as he stood at the door, "I have to make a visit. I should be back in an hour or so." Within 15 minutes, George was knocking at the door of the spinster's boarding house. When he had inquired within whether she was there, the housekeeper invited him to make himself comfortable in the drawing room while she went to fetch her. A minute or two after he'd sat down on the couch, the spinster entered the room. "I hope you don't mind me bringing my sewing. I got a bit behind last night," she said, as George stood up to greet her. "Not at all," replied George. "I will not keep you. I came to ask you a simple question. Would you reconsider the gift you gave the orphanage? £100 is a lot of money to anyone, but for you, well..." He struggled to think of the right way to say it. "If God blessed you with the money, perhaps He intended you to keep it in case there is a time when you need it." He pulled the note from his pocket. "It was a generous gift, but I do not want to take advantage of your generosity." George smiled apologetically as he placed the money on the table between them. "But, Mr. Muller," began the spinster, laying her needlework on her lap, "you don't understand. I want to give that money. I got an inheritance of £480 from my father. I gave my mother £100, and the new orphanage £100. The rest I used to pay off my father's debts. I am perfectly happy with what I've done with the money." "Maybe you don't understand," said George, feeling he was getting nowhere. "How could he take money from someone this poor?" "Now, Mr. Muller, I don't want to contradict you, but I believe I do understand," the woman said very seriously. "The Lord Jesus gave His last drop of blood for me, and should I not give all the money I have for Him? In fact, I have £5 over, and I have decided to give that to you as well, for you to share with the poorest members at the chapel." George's eyes swam with tears. He knew he could say nothing but thank you. He had come to the boarding house to find answers, and he had found them. The spinster was giving the money because she wanted to, and not because she felt manipulated into it by anything or anyone. "Thank you," George said as he left the room. "I don't say thank you for just myself, because you have not given the money to me, but you have given it to the orphans of Bristol. May God bless your generosity." The spinster nodded. "I only hope God will allow me to give more before I die," she said. On his way home, George stopped outside a large 3-story house on Wilson Street, not far from Gideon Chapel. A member of the congregation had told him it had just come up for rent, and George was anxious to see it. The house was number 6 in a large row of identical houses. Each house was made of brick, had 6 windows, 2 on each floor, and had the same wooden eaves. As George cupped his hands against the front window pane and peered inside, he heard a voice behind him. "Interested in the house, sir? It's for rent, you know." George stepped back and turned around. He looked into the eyes of a tall, well-dressed man. "I can show you inside if you would like," the man offered. "Thank you," said George. "I'd appreciate that." Inside, the house was roomier than George had imagined. It had 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a large living room on the middle floor, and a stove in the kitchen on the ground floor. It was big enough to cook for 2 families. The house was perfect, and by the time George left it, he had agreed to rent it. He hurried home to tell Mary. It was almost too good to be true. He had £105 in his pocket. He had now had a house to run the orphanage in, and by the time he got home, he had an opening date in mind as well, February 3rd, 1836. Chapter 10. An Orphanage on Wilson Street. On the morning of February 3rd, 1836, George Muller hurried to number 6 Wilson Street. In spite of the icy sleet falling, he was humming to himself as he walked. Today was the day the orphanage opened, and he could hardly believe how quickly everything had come together. It had been only 7 weeks since he stood in Gideon Chapel and announced his intention to start the orphanage. He remembered how some church members had told him it couldn't be done. He was glad that today those members were going to see that God does indeed answer prayer, and that things that seem impossible with men are possible to him. As he turned the brass key in the lock and stepped inside, George was deeply thankful for everything he saw. The tables and chairs in the parlor, the blue velvet couch, the rose-colored rug, the chest of drawers upstairs filled with stacks of neatly folded underwear, petticoats, and socks, the cupboards with rows of shoes, the linen closet piled high with blankets and pillowcases. Every single item was an answer to prayer. Even the house itself had been rented with donated money that was an answer to prayer. Since he had begun the adventure of starting the orphanage, George had kept a careful prayer diary. Down one side of each page, in his diary, he had recorded each prayer request, and on the other side, the date and the way in which it was answered. Every item in the house was an answer to prayer. Even the coal, which he began shoveling into the fireplace to warm the house, was an answer to prayer. George washed his hands and dried them on a towel in the kitchen. Then he walked into the parlor and took a stack of papers from his bag. The papers were forms he had picked up from the printer the day before, forms for the guardians of the orphans to fill out. They asked for the child's full name, birth date, age, and education, date of the child's parents' death, and a person to contact in an emergency. As George had been drawing up the forms, he was aware that many of them would never be filled out completely. Some children, as young as 2 or 3 years old, wandered around alone. If some caring person or policeman brought them to the orphanage someday, it would be something if the child could remember his or her first name, let alone all the other information. Still, George reminded himself that he couldn't accept applications from children that young, even if he wanted to. For now, the orphanage was set up only for girls aged 7 to 12. He hoped they or a guardian would be able to fill out more of the information. George laid the forms out around the table so that several people could work on them at once. He knew many of the girls would be unable to read or write, but he hoped they would bring someone with them who could. By lunchtime, George had rearranged the forms 5 or 6 times as he waited for a knock at the door. The attic walls needed to be painted, but he hated to go upstairs and get up to his elbows in paint because the girls would be arriving at the door at any moment, or so he told himself. But the girls did not arrive. By 5 o'clock that night, not a single orphan had arrived at the fully equipped orphan house. The new house parents had been by several times to see whether anyone had shown up, and since no one had, they left for the day. The beds that George had expected little girls to be climbing into sat untouched, their bedspreads unruffled. George was not humming when he walked home that evening. In his mind, he reviewed the past 7 weeks. What had gone wrong? Had he become too proud of what was doing? Was that why God was not entrusting a single child to him? Hadn't he prayed hard enough? Was the whole idea of a free orphanage for needy children just too far-fetched? Were the naysayers right after all? George did not know the answers, and by the time he swung open the door of his own house, his heart was heavy. Mary rushed to meet him, with Lydia not far behind. "Tell me all about it," she said, her face beaming with an expectant smile. "What are their names? How many are there? How old are they?" George shook his head as he took off his coat and scarf. He sat down heavily in a chair. "There aren't any," he said with a sigh. Mary frowned. "What do you mean, George? There aren't any what?" "Any orphans," he replied flatly. The smile evaporated from Mary's face and was replaced with a horrified look. "You mean not a single girl came?" she questioned. George nodded. "Not a single one," he answered. And then he added, "Maybe this was all a mistake after all." Mary walked over to her husband and put her hands on her hips in a determined stance. "How can you say that, George Muller? Look at all the prayers God has answered for us. Isn't the house an answer to prayer? Look how much money has been provided. Isn't that an answer to prayer too? And the calico, the dishes, the furniture, everything in that house is an answer to prayer, and we both know it." George lifted his head and looked up at her for the first time since entering the house. "I know," he said, "but there aren't any orphans, and that's not an answer to prayer, is it, Mary?" With that, Mary clapped her hands together and laughed out loud. Startled, George stared up at her. This was no time to be making fun. Couldn't she see that? "But George," she said, her shining eyes wrapped up in a broad smile, "that's the whole point. We never did pray for the children. Don't you see? We prayed for coal and food and paint and workers, but we never thought to pray for children." George was laughing now too. "Mary, you are quite right. I didn't even think about praying for orphans because there's so many on the streets. I was sure we'd have applications from more people than we could house." He caught his wife by the waist and swung her around. "Let's go and pray, Mrs. Muller," he said. For the second morning in a row, George hummed as he walked to Wilson Street. This time he felt sure the orphan girls would come. After all, he had asked God to send them, and send them he did. The first children applied that day. By the end of the month, the orphanage housed 26 girls and 42 more on the waiting list. It was April 2nd before George found the time to organize an official opening ceremony. Hundreds of people came to see the orphanage and to listen to Henry Craik preach at the official opening. George had thanked the many hundreds of people who had helped make the orphanage a reality. Some, he pointed out, had helped in large ways, such as with the ton of coal that had been delivered to the house one day, and the anonymous gift of 100 pounds that had arrived the next day. But many of the gifts had been small, yet they meant just as much, both to the person who had given them and to George, who told how a small boy, who looked like he could have been an orphan himself, knocked boldly on his door the day before, a shilling held tightly in his hand. "This is for your girls," the boy said when George opened the door. "I found a ring, and when I returned it to the owner, she gave me a shilling for being so honest. Here it is." A woman in Bristol sent George 5 shillings with a note saying she had gone to buy a new dress and deliberately chose the plainest one she could find rather than the more elaborate and expensive kind she normally purchased. The 5 shillings represented the money she had saved by purchasing the less expensive dress, and she wanted the orphanage to have it. The year rushed by at a hectic pace. Besides having 30 girls to care for, George was still pastor of the Gideon Chapel, which was growing rapidly, and he had not eased off of his efforts for the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for home and abroad. 350 boys and girls were now in school, and the teachers' salaries, rents for the classrooms, the books were all provided by the institution. It seemed that the more responsibilities George took on, the more he was able to carry. Although George never asked for help with the orphan girls, offers poured in. A local doctor offered to treat the girls for free, and George's old church at Tigmouth sent supplies and money to help. Housekeepers, laundry maids, and matrons either volunteered their services or agreed to work for lower wages than they could receive elsewhere. Most people would have thought that the hardest thing about starting an orphanage was raising the money. But for George Muller, the hardest thing was turning away needy children. The orphanage was not set up for boys or girls under 7 years of age. It upset George greatly to have to tell a child or the child's temporary guardian that he was unable to help. So, even though he told no one from the day of the official opening of the orphanage at number 6 Wilson Street, a plan had been taking shape in George's mind. According to his plan, there would be a second orphanage and a third, until every orphan in Bristol was taken care of and taught to read and told about God. In October, George felt it was time to start putting his plan into action. He rented a second house located at number 1 Wilson Street. The house was ideal in many ways. While it was an exact replica of the one at number 6 and all the other houses in the row as long on Wilson Street, but it was the beginning of the row and had an empty corner lot beside it. George managed to rent both the house and the adjoining lot. By the end of November, the house was outfitted with cribs and rocking horses, and the lot had been turned into a playground for both orphanages. On November 28, 1836, the orphanage at number 1 Wilson Street was opened for business. Some of the older girls from the other orphanage helped with the babies and toddlers at the new one. Many of the girls would be going into domestic service as nannies, and the younger children gave them someone to practice their skills on, though a matron was always watching to make sure the babies were bathed and played with properly. The week leading up to Christmas was a happy one for the Muller family, and especially happy for the children in the orphanages. The children's eyes shone with delight as they asked George how many more days there were to go, what they would be having for Christmas dinner. But George loved to tease them and tell them he had forgotten all about Christmas. Of course he hadn't. He knew it would be the first real Christmas for many of the children, and he prayed that God would make it memorable for them. Christmas was memorable. All sorts of wonderful, delicious things were brought to the orphanage by the people of Bristol. Turkeys and ducks hung in the laundry room, ready to be cooked. An enormous drum containing 100 pounds of treacle sat in the corner of the kitchen, its top slightly askew, where some of the children had already tasted its thick, sweet contents. Oranges and bananas from a shipment that had arrived in port from the West Indies were sent to the orphanage, and many churchwomen made new Sunday clothes for the girls. As George gathered his family, 60 orphan children, the orphanage staff, and Henry Craik for Christmas dinner, he could not help but to smile with pure joy. He wondered what the policemen in Wolfenbrattel would think of him now. It had been 15 Christmases ago that they'd sat in a cold, bare prison cell, there after being captured, trying to leave town without paying the innkeeper for his room. If George could have seen then what he was to become, he would have never believed it. God had taken George Muller, the boy who cared for no one but himself, and turned him into a man now responsible for lives of dozens of orphan children. What a journey it had been, and George could not help but wonder where he would be and what he would be doing at Christmases to come. Chapter 11. Food for the Children. "The King is dead, long live the Queen," read the headline of the Tuesday, June 20th, 1837 edition of the Bristol Times. George already knew what had happened, as did nearly everyone in Bristol. The news had traveled fast. All flags had been lowered to half-mast. Shops were closed, and church bells tolled endlessly. That night after dinner, George and Mary Muller spent a long time praying for the new 18-year-old Queen, Victoria. Lydia, on the other hand, wanted to know what all the fuss was about. "Why don't the church bells stop ringing, Papa?" she asked. "Are they stuck?" "No, my dear," replied George, hoisting her onto his lap. "King William IV died this morning, and many people are sad." "He must have been very important," said Lydia. "He was," George replied, "and people from England are sad. But on Saturday, everyone is going to be happy, and we will be having the biggest parade you've ever seen. We will be celebrating a new queen. Her name is Queen Victoria, and she is only 13 years older than you." Lydia giggled at the thought. On Saturday, Lydia was at the parade with her parents and about 40 of the older orphan children. All of the people were given a Union Jack to wave as they watched the long procession of mayors, magistrates, and ministers go by in their carriages. After the parade, George hurried home. He still had a lot of work to do if he was going to open the boys' orphanage at number 3 Wilson Street by the end of the month. Need for the new orphanage, which would house about 40 boys, had become urgent, since there was nowhere else to send the little boys from the infant house when they turned 7 years old. The third orphan house opened on time, and George was now responsible for 81 children and 9 full-time staff. The waiting list of the children wanting to get into the orphanage was long enough to fill 3 more homes. Besides tending to the orphans, George, through the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for Home and Abroad, was providing an education for 350 children in day schools and another 320 in Sunday schools. Later that year, George waited for the first copies of the book he had written, Narrative of Some of the Lord's Dealings with George Muller, to roll off the printing press. It had not been an easy decision to publish a book about what he had learned so far in his Christian life. In fact, George prayed more about publishing the book than about any other decision he'd made in his life. The last thing he wanted to do was to make himself look more important or give the impression that he had more faith than other Christians. But so many people had written to ask for advice on how to lead a simple life of faith that, in the end, he decided to write it down in a book. The book sold briskly, and more than ever, George was asked to speak in other churches. It was not possible for him to accept these invitations, however, for one simple reason. George Muller was a very sick man. His health had deteriorated again, and he began to suffer from terrible headaches. The only temporary relief he seemed to find from them was to tie a handkerchief very tightly around his head. Sometimes he was forced to lie in bed for days on end. Over the next several months, he spent a great deal of time in other parts of the country, mostly staying with friends in the countryside, trying to recover. It worked a little. In March 1838, George decided to return to Prussia for a visit. He hoped the change of air would be good for him and provide relief from the sickness he sought. He also wanted to use the trip to encourage German missionaries. He made the trip alone, leaving Mary behind to run the orphanage, which she had in fact been doing for most of the previous year. George left England on April 2nd, 1838. The trip across the English Channel was rough, and George quickly added seasickness to his list of ailments. Still, he arrived safely in Hamburg on April 9th and made his way to Berlin, where he spent 10 days meeting with missionaries. From Berlin, he went to Hermeslaug to visit his father. The two of them now got along much better than they had when George had been at Hale University. Johann Muller was interested in all that his son was doing in England. He also wanted to know how the young Queen Victoria was getting along. After all, the Queen's mother was a German princess. After a month away, George made his way back to Bristol. He realized he had been right about the change of air. He felt much better. In fact, although he got sick from time to time, he never again experienced long, drawn-out bouts of sickness, such as the one he had just suffered through. It was just as well George didn't stay away for too long, because things were rapidly becoming difficult back in Bristol. On August 18th, 1838, George wrote in his journal, "I have not one penny in hand for the orphans. In a day or two, many pounds will be needed. My eyes are on the Lord." By the end of that day, 5 pounds had arrived, a gift from a woman who had sold some jewelry for the benefit of the orphans. It was enough money to buy food for a day, but by evening they were back in the same situation. On August 20th, George again received a gift of 5 pounds, which was also used to buy food. The next day it was 12 pounds, and 3 pounds the following day. Again and again, George added up the books, only to find that the orphan houses did not have a penny for food. Each time he prayed, money arrived in the nick of time. Given the pressing need, there was a temptation to use other money to meet it. But George stood firm. On one occasion, a check for 220 pounds arrived from a wealthy landowner in the area. The cover letter with the check said the money was for the Scriptural Knowledge Institution for home and abroad. George knew that all he had to do was ask whether he could use it for the orphans, and the wealthy landowner would immediately agree. But George would not ask. He wanted nothing to do with manipulating circumstances. God had promised to provide for them all, and George would continue to pray and believe that. He would not take money that had been given for one thing and use it for something else. Another time, George received a large sum of money from a woman he knew was in debt. From the day he became a Christian, George hated debt. He believed that if God intended for someone to have something, he would provide the money beforehand to buy it, not afterwards. Because of this, he knew he could not keep the woman's donation. Even though he did not have enough money for the food the next day, he sent the money back and suggested the woman use it to pay her creditors instead. The next day, as it always did, enough money arrived to pay for the daily supplies of the orphan houses. On one occasion, George managed to unintentionally insult a woman who had come to give him a large sum of money. The woman's name was Mrs. Brightman. One day, when George arrived home from the Wilson Street orphan homes, he found Mrs. Brightman drinking tea in the parlor with Mary. After Mary introduced her, George sat down and joined in the conversation, which quickly turned to the ways in which God provided for the orphans. Mrs. Brightman seemed interested in everything George said, and as George looked at her, he was sure he knew why. Mrs. Brightman was a tiny woman, dressed in clothes that were too thin for November, and her boots were all but worn through. George was sure she wanted to know the secret to God's provision for her own life. The more they talked, the more sorry George felt for her. Abruptly, Mrs. Brightman said, "Well, I have to go now. You'll be wanting to get your dinner on the table. Thank you for your time." George looked at Mary, who promptly spoke. "But Mrs. Brightman, we would be honored to have you stay for dinner. You have so many questions, and we are enjoying your company." "No, I wouldn't hear of it. I can't impose on you good folks any longer. I'll be off now. Besides, I have a train to catch. Not that I'll be able to eat anything they serve. Get me my shawl if you would be so kind, Mrs. Muller. It's the only one I have, and I don't mean to leave it behind." Something stirred inside George as he watched Mary go get Mrs. Brightman's shawl. Mrs. Brightman was such a thin woman, out there in the cold, with only a shawl to keep her warm. And what was she saying about not eating anything on the train? She had come all this way and didn't even have enough money for a piece of pie. As Mrs. Brightman stood and readied herself to leave, George decided to do something he had never done before. He walked over to Mrs. Brightman and cleared his throat. "My dear woman," he began, "I can see that you are trying hard to follow the ways of God, as we do. However, it's obvious you lack material provision and the money to buy yourself nourishing food. As my wife has told you, we often do not have much ourselves, but I would like to offer you whatever we have. We would like to share our money with you through a common purse. Whenever you need money, I want you to send a message to me, and I will share whatever we have with you. Now," he reached into his pocket, "let me give you money enough to buy dinner on the train." Mrs. Brightman spluttered and then burst into full laughter. Her whole body shook, and it was a good minute before she could regain her composure. "Whatever makes you think I need your money, Mr. Muller?" she said finally. George could feel his face turning red. You said you didn't have money to buy dinner, and you have only one shawl," he said politely. No, I did not say I cannot buy supper. I said I would not. I have a delicate stomach, and those greasy meals are not good for my digestion. As for my shawl, you are right. I only have one, but I can only wear one at a time, so it's sufficient for me, is it not?" George nodded, not knowing what to say next. He had obviously insulted Mrs. Brightman by offering to share his money with her. "I must go now," said Mrs. Brightman, "but before I do, let me tell you why I came here today. I recently inherited £500, and I wanted to see if I should give it to the orphanage. So, you see, I am not poor at all, Mr. Muller, and I certainly don't need your common purse." When Mrs. Brightman was gone, George and Mary stood staring at each other. I had no idea," said Mary. "Neither did I, but I certainly did insult her, didn't I? To think I offered to share our shilling or two with her when she had £500 in the bank," groaned George. The Mullers heard nothing more from Mrs. Brightman until, one day, several months later, George arrived home to find her once again sipping tea with Mary. She looked excited when George came in the door. "Mr. Muller," she began, "I thought much about what you had said regarding sharing your common purse with me, and it touched me greatly. I know you didn't have much, and you were willing to share what little you had with me. I have decided to share what I have with you. A check for £500 will be arriving here within a month." George and Mary had a special time of prayer that evening. £500 would be enough to keep all 3 orphan houses running for at least a year. By 1840, other people in England had become concerned about the plight of the orphans and were addressing the problem in their own way. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist that year. Through this famous author's book, upper-class English people were faced for the first time with the horrible reality of the lives of these children. The social tide was slowly beginning to turn in favor of protecting children from such awful circumstances. But there was still much to do. While he was still busy with his various responsibilities, in the spring of 1843, George began thinking it was time to make another trip to Prussia. By this time, many people had written asking him to come. George was particularly impressed by a small group of Baptists who lived in Stuttgart. They were the first group of German Christians outside of the state-regulated church who had asked him to help, and he was eager to give it. The more he thought about going, however, the more he knew he couldn't. At least, not right away. There were too many obstacles. Before he would feel comfortable leaving Bristol, there needed to be at least 200 pounds in the bank, so the staff would not have to take on the responsibility of praying for the day-to-day operating expenses. Then there was the matter of the 4th orphan house on Wilson Street, which was about to open. A suitable matron still had not been found to oversee the house. George had also decided that the next time he went home, he would like to take Mary with him, and the total amount of their passage, plus money to live while they were away, was quite large. And lastly, George had translated his book into German, but it had not yet been published because of the cost. If he went to Prussia, he wanted to be able to take copies of the German edition of his book to give away. The cost of publishing the German edition alone was 200 pounds. The amount of money George would need in hand before he could make the trip to Prussia quickly mounted up, especially for a man who was still praying for enough money to buy the next day's bread and milk for the orphans. Yet George and Mary had the faith to believe that God would provide the amount needed. They prayed and asked that if God's will was for them to go to Prussia, He would show it by providing the money they would need. For almost a month, they began praying about the trip. The financial situation of the orphans seemed to get worse, but George and Mary kept praying, and on July 12th, 1843, they heard some wonderful news. A man whom George did not know gave him 700 pounds to be used for 4 purposes. First, some of the money was to be used among the poor Christians in Bristol. Second, some of it was to be used to publish George's book in German. Third, some of it was to go toward running the orphan houses. And fourth, the balance was to be used to strengthen the faith of German Christians. In one day, George had the answer to all his prayers, except a matron for the new orphan house at number 4 Wilson Street. She was hired a week later, leaving George and Mary feeling they could now travel to Prussia. The Mullers stayed away 6 months, working among the churches in Stuttgart and distributing tracts and copies of George's book. Regrettably, Johann Muller, George's father, had died 4 years before, so Mary had never had the opportunity to meet him. In February 1844, the Mullers returned to Bristol and their work among the orphans.